All right, Lecture 7, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages. Okay, so finally we are going to kind of get to something that's we've been dancing around a lot in this course. The past several lectures, we've been talking about kind of the origins of the idea of the Middle Ages within kind of both academic and popular spheres, kind of how we got to where we are and thinking about what the Middle Ages are. And here, we're going to start talking about specifically about how race kind of comes from the Middle Ages, perhaps, how people have used race to think about the Middle Ages, kind of in more depth, particularly on that point than we've gone into, both, again, in academic and popular spheres. This lecture will be much more on the academic side of things. The next lecture will be much more on the popular side of things. Next lecture, kind of race, because this would be a lecture on race and new medievalism. That is to say, the academic kind of side of things. And then the next lecture is going to be on race and neo-medievalism, which is to say the popular side of things, even though, of course, that dichotomy does not make any sense and does not hold up under any sort of scrutiny. That's going to be actually a thing we're going to talk about a lot this semester. Before I get into the contents of the lecture, I just want to note, kind of put on your schedules in kind of mid-April, there is a conference at Brandeis called Race Before Race, which is on, there's going to be a bunch of pre-modern scholars kind of talking about this. It will be, of course, because, pandemic, broadcast on Zoom. I will give out more announcements when that comes, but I think that will be very much worthwhile if you kind of go and listen to a lecture or two. All right. So, to the subject. This is, again, a topic we've been kind of dancing around a lot. I've talked a lot about the ways in which history and medieval studies and the academy are racialized and have kind of integrate themselves into structures of racial power, racialized structures of power. But I kind of want to focus down here into specifically the engagement medieval studies has had with race. Because the first thing to note, kind of when talking about this, is that very few people, academic or otherwise, really understand what race is. Most of us kind of think we do, but we don't look at it too hard, right? We think, okay, skin color, black people and white people. Like, that's, it's obvious. And because it's obvious, people tend not to think about it too hard. That's kind of a universal with that sort of a thing. So it's going to interfere a little bit. Oh, we don't want that yet. Let's get me out of the way here. There we go. Okay. This is kind of the long form of a definition I've given before by Dr. Geraldine Hang, that race is, our definition that I'm working with here, that race is the selective essentialization of characteristics in order to create power gradients between human groups. Now, Dr. Hang, when she gives this kind of definition in her book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, to which this lecture has simply appended a question mark, she gives a lot of caveats to that, right? She calls race one of the primary names we have, right? We have other names for it. She acknowledges that right in the first sentence. And she says we retain the name of race for the thing that we're talking about because it's important to us now, right? Saying the word race in a modern context because of modern concerns is important. Is important to say this word rather than ethnicity or culture or something like that. That this is a repeating tendency, that it's a thing that has iterations, that has versions of itself, right? That all work around a common theme. And the difference is that are selectively essentialized as absolute and fundamental, right? The idea that racial difference forms the core of who you are. And again, to distribute power differently between human groups. And then the second sentence is pretty much a rewording of the things she said in the first sentence. And that the final sentence, my understanding, is a summary of the previous kind of things, right? Race is the structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences, rather than a substantive content, right? Another way to kind of say this is that race isn't real, right? Race is a social understanding. It has no substantive reality. And we're going to get people kind of understand that. Race is a social construct. I think a lot of people is a phrase that a lot of people have heard. I don't think it's a phrase a lot of people have actually internalized the actual full meaning of it. And we're going to get to that in a second. But the most important thing as historians that we're going to take away from this definition is that Dr. Heng is trying to emphasize the fact that there is not just one construction of race. That racializations, that racisms, that races, or race making is kind of a good way that race making occurs multiple times in different ways across time and space. Time and space, right? Because there is not even a single modern definition of race. And that is true whether you think of modernity as a historical period, which is to say that like Walter Scott's understanding of what race is and your or my understanding of what race is are different, right? Because Scott had this kind of climatological idea, which we saw with Brian de Bois-Guilbert. And, Walter Scott would have thought that Italians or the Irish were different races, or Greeks, for example, whereas we wouldn't really hold with those definitions now. But like also within time, currently, right now, the idea of race, the race making in Brazil, is subtly different than race making in Europe and the Americas. Race making in Brazil is less based on heritability. It's less important to your race. Your parents' race is less important to your race, what your race is, than in the Americas. This is not to say that there isn't a profound anti-blackness in Brazil, which there is, or that kind of the race making in Brazil isn't kind of moving towards a European or American structure, but that it is still not the same. And there's a lot of scholarship on that. If you want citations, I have them. And the other kind of thing I kind of want to go with that is that, okay, actually, so what is this race making that we have we as Americans, I guess, would be the way I want to specify it. Again, subtle differences between time and place. But let's kind of drill down for America specifically. In the US, when we talk about race, what we're really talking about is the construction of a group by defining another group. And we're actually not talking about the discussion. Race is not identifying, in fact, black people. Race is not saying that these people are black. Race in the US is, in fact, the construction of a group by defining its negative. That is to say, race in the United States is primarily about defining who is white. That is to say, blackness, the idea of blackness, the idea of Asian, etc., the idea of a person of color, is a construct that defines who is white. The two racial categories in the United States are white and not white, right? And if you think about it that way, this is really important because it defines whiteness, the state of being white, as normal, right? There is the normal state, and then there is the abnormal state, right? And the abnormal state is the state of not being normal, right? That being white is the normal state, and not being white is abnormal. And we can see this most clearly in language. And this is a point I've touched on before, but I'm going to make again because it's very much worth reiterating. Because in English, as a language, adjectives mark nouns that are non-normative or special. Like, that's what an adjective does. It gives you information about that noun, and the reason why it gives you information, an adjective gives you information about a noun, is because that noun is in some ways special, unusual, not normal. So a blue bird specifies a category of bird, right? A bird which has blue coloring. A calm river specifies a type of river which is not normal, right? Most rivers flow fast. If we say calm river, we're like, oh no, it's going to be like that, right? A deep sea, as opposed to a regular sea. A deep sea is one that goes down further than a sea. And this is particularly true with race, kind of with the construction of race. It's particularly true when we used color adjectives that describe color, right, to talk about humans and their bodies. And in this case, whiteness is the assumed normative state in kind of imaginaries. That is to say, Toni Morrison puts this, she says, if a man is white, we all know he is because nobody says so, right? There's a man standing over there versus there is a black man standing over there. One of them, right, the fact that you have to specify in that case shows you something about what is considered normative. This is very, very strong. This is this kind of tendency to associate an undescribed noun, right, an undescribed person as white, to assume that an undescribed person is white, is incredibly strong. One example, for example, is the character of Rue in the Hunger Games, actually. That's a recent example, who is actually described as black in the text, but, reading is difficult. So some people just didn't see that. And when it came to time for her to be casted, there was a large outcry from white audiences, or white kind of viewers saying, like, that's not how I imagined her. I thought she was normal, right? And of course, not kind of critically thinking through what they're saying, or, deliberately saying what they're saying. But the idea that this character, who they imagined kind of sympathized with, they imagined to be what they saw as normal, which is to say, white. And that kind of example of what this is very strong. It's also kind of the example with Rue is also kind of an example of what roles we expect, in which roles we expect to encounter persons of color in fiction, and that's a thing we're going to talk about more later. But kind of because this is so strong, because this is such an important way in which we talk about people, we should also pay attention to where it falls apart. And it particularly falls apart with people who we think of as medieval, right? This is a black knight. It's a knight with black armor. The skin color of the knight is white, right? This can also be a black knight, right? It's a foolish black knight, one who doesn't realize his limbs are being chopped off because Monty Python is a little bit absurd. But his blackness does not refer to his skin color, even though you cannot see it, right? His blackness refers to his armor, his clothing. The person underneath is assumed to be white. And the reason why we know this is because this is a joke, right? Martin Lawrence's movie Black Knight, that's a funny title. Because, of course, Black Knight does not mean a black person who is a knight. Right? It means a knight in dark clothing. And of course, if we, I don't want to explain to kind of belabor that point, but kind of the reason why this movie is a comedy, or the reason why this title, the Black Knight, can be a title for a comedy about a black person being put into the Middle Ages, is because the Middle Ages are so strongly associated with normative whiteness. That the people we imagine in the Middle Ages are so we default so much to thinking of them as white that this is funny through kind of irony. And this kind of also kind of the example here, right? Oh, and yeah, a comedy about a man out of his time, right? We're going to talk about this denial of coevalness, but let's, just not to put too fine a point on it, with an arrow and a red box and a little GIF there, GIF, ooh, start a fight. Unless we spend time, right? What this shows us is that unless we spend some time kind of picking apart how we now see race, how you and I race other people, how we construct and define race, we will have issues as historians. For example, one of the examples I myself have worked on is that there's a 13th century author, Jacques de Vitry. So I think he's writing about 1215, if that helps. He says, Negros Aethiopes turpes reputamos, which is Latin for, we think black Ethiopians are repulsive. And without examining our preconceptions of how race works, and really kind of paying very close attention, this sentence seems like offensive but banal, right? It's gross, but we might just, this doesn't sound like, it just sounds racist, right? It doesn't sound weird in any way, shape, or form. But why does he say black Ethiopians, right? Aren't normal Ethiopians black? Like, don't we just kind of normally picture a black person when we say Ethiopian? And what that kind of reveals to us, what that kind of pause, and looking at the focusing on the fact that perhaps Jacques' language is not what we would expect, shows us that we assume that a color adjective, when placed next to something that is a person, right, talks about their skin color, normally. But there's no reason to think that Jacques isn't using black in the same way we talk about black knights. We've defaulted to an answer, but that answer isn't necessarily true. And unless we want to insist that Jacques also raced people in the exact same way we do now, and he didn't, we need to take another look at that. And when we do this, when we take another look at that kind of what Jacques is doing with his black Ethiopian, we're really pushing on the edge of the works that academics have done. I'll give you an answer to why I think that's the case in a little bit, but not a lot of people have thought about this, right? Because academics have worked to understand the origins of modern racializations, but not really thought about medieval racializations. And so there are very basic methodological problems with the work that has been done in medieval studies in this regard. For example, one very eminent historian, professor at Oxford, who was himself taught by a previous professor at Oxford, Robert Bartlett, says in his very well-regarded book, The Making of Europe, Conquest, Colonization, and Cultural Change, something I have had to read several times over, he says that modern forms of racism seize on clear biological markers and insist on indivisible biological differences, and therefore concludes that medieval ethnicity was a social construct rather than a biological datum. And more on that kind of distinction he makes there between ethnicity and race in a second. But this is not right. This is not an understanding of race that anyone, whether in 1993 when Robert Bartlett was writing, or now, who has actually studied race as a concept would understand, or would say is correct, would have any sort of kind of agreement with. They would not agree with Bartlett, right? Because race can have a biological component, but is never kind of in its idea, but it is never actually a biological reality, right? And race is not, in the end, based in any way, shape, or form in biology. And this is an idea that, if you have not encountered critical race theory before, this sounds absurd. This sounds insane and illogical, right? Obviously, no, it's skin color, race. It's easy. And so convinced of Bartlett that he was so obviously true, that his kind of understanding of race is so obviously correct, he didn't cite anything, which is weird for kind of this sort of an academic work, right? There was plenty of stuff telling him he's wrong if he ever just wanted to look, but to him, what race was so obvious, he did not. All right, race is not based in biology. You cannot determine race through genetic markers. There's not nearly enough evolutionary time, or separation of populations that would make people genetically different because of their races. Certain biological attributes, kind of scientific attributes that have been associated with race, have usually either been proven to be false, such as the idea that people from Africa have, or people with ancestors from Africa have a smaller lung capacity. That's an idea that developed in the 19th century and was still kicking around in 1970, but just has no basis in fact, or proven to be kind of, because that one's just made up out of the whole cloth. It's like some 19th century scientist says, I think black people have less of a lung capacity because they're weaker humans. And everyone in science just went, oh, okay. And just didn't think about it again. Or biological kind of signs that are associated with race, such as heart disease, have been shown to be fictions, right? That this, the association of kind of African Americans with heart disease is in fact what people are actually seeing is this association of poverty with heart disease, and that the race actually doesn't come into it at all. And race is not based in biology. One of the reasons why we can know for sure that race is not actually picking up on anything biological, right, is, for example, is the fact that it is purely based on social perception. And we can see this in specific cases. One is the case of this woman, Rachel Dolezal. I don't know kind of how many of you know about this story because it was 2015, so it was a little while ago. I remember it very distinctly. Rachel Dolezal was a professor of Africana Studies in Washington State. She was also the chapter president for the NAACP. On the right, you see her as an adult. On the left, you see her as a teenager. She is, according to her Wikipedia article, known for identifying as a black woman despite having been born to white parents. Right? This was a big scandal when it came out for multiple reasons. Like, the obvious one is that she's been claiming to be a black person and kind of taking resources from that and, positioning herself in society that way. And a lot of people kind of have made this story about her and about how she was a terrible person for doing this, which I don't think is wrong. I think that's pretty fair. But that's not really the interest. For me, kind of as an academic who studies race, the interesting thing about this entire story and this controversy is that people believed her for 25 years. Right? There was until her parents, Rachel's parents, came forward and said, this is what she looked like as a teenager, this photo, right? Everyone she talked to, from her colleagues at the NAACP, to her colleagues at the university, to her husband, considered her to be a black woman. Of course, this doesn't quite work in the other direction. Although there are some slight examples. The backstory to Hooded Justice in this the Watchmen series that came out last year is a particularly good example of that. But what Rachel's story tells us is that race is a purely social construct. The reason why people would believe that a white girl was, with no kind of ambiguity about the fact that she's a white girl, is who she is because she was able to perform in a certain way, right? She was able to give herself a certain history, a degree from Howard University, historically black university, working in Africana studies. All these things kind of reinforced her credibility socially. of that she was what she said she was. Um, and so, therefore, from this example, we find that race is a purely, and I really want to emphasize that, purely social construct. And I also want to emphasize the fact that when I say race is a purely social construct, everyone goes, okay, so you mean it's made up. No. Because it's a purely social construct, race is incredibly real, right? It is, in fact, more real than some things that are just simply biological. Because it defines on how we act, and we don't usually act on kind of things that are true. We act on things that we think are true. Very Tolkien there. On the other side of things, and this is important, kind of this idea that race is a purely social construct is incredibly important for us kind of thinking about medieval history, because you have people who use modern race to identify black people, right? They look for people who we would now race as black in the medieval past, and when they don't find them, conclude that there weren't any. And so you have things like the compendium, a compendium volume which is entitled "The Black in Medieval Art," which that's a title. I'm not really sure what I want to do with that. Titled "Black in Medieval Art." This volume collected as many images as it could find of people who are recognizably black to a modern audience that they could in medieval art, such as this guy, Saint Maurice. Saint Maurice, who we will talk about a lot and have talked about a little, is the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire. He was generally depicted with what we would now call black features from the 12th century, 11th century onwards, 1100, 1200 onwards. But curiously, this compendium, when they're collecting images of Saint Maurice, excluded images where he was not recognizably black. That is, even though everyone thought of him as black from 1200, if there was a coin from 1300 that showed him with a helmet on and therefore you couldn't see his face or skin color, it was not included in this volume, even though that is a picture of the black in medieval art. And this together is one of the reasons why we imagine it's both a product of and the reason why we imagine the medieval past as a place without racial diversity. Because the preconceptions we bring to the question, was the medieval diverse, was medieval times diverse, prevent us from seeing it in the first place. And so, of course, when we look at something like that black Ethiopian, which I talked about, 5 minutes ago or so, of course we're left puzzled by it because we haven't thought through why it should exist, right? And if we look closely at language, right, Latin specifically, if we bother to kind of take what we actually know about race and apply it to the Middle Ages, we find that in Latin, color words do not describe bodies very often. Or even have the possibility of describing bodies very often. Particularly the color words black and white are almost never in a kind of semantic context that clearly says that this is something to do with a body. And this is incredibly clear in the interpretation of a scriptural verse. The Bible. The Bible is the most popular book for almost most of Western history. And there's a lot of kind of work done explaining what the Bible is. We can see this called commentary and translations. And in particular, there's an emphasis on a book in the Bible from the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as it tends to be called the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, the Cantica Canticorum. You can see that kind of in the middle there in blue, which just means the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is a little bit weird. It's not what you would think you would encounter in a biblical text. It is, in fact, a love song between a bride and a bridegroom about how they long for each other, pretty obviously sexually. The phrase, what was it? I am a wall and my tits are like turrets. That's in the Bible, and it's in the Song of Songs. So, if you're a medieval monk who's come across this, and I know you guys don't know a lot about medieval monks, but you kind of suspect that this is a little freaky to them, right? And so they spent a lot of time and energy telling you what this erotic love poem actually means and how it actually describes, the church's relationship to Christ, etc. Whatever. The important part about this, for our purposes here, is that there's the Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 5, says, Negro sum sed formosa. It's the bride speaking in her first person, and she says, I am black but beautiful. Although some translations have it, I am black and beautiful. And all those commentaries that we have on the Song of Songs, right, all those monks trying to figure out what the hell this means, that are written before 1200, or before 1100 actually, never say that this word, that this declaration, I am black, applies to the bride's skin color. They all agree it applies to her spiritual state, that she is sinful, right? That's what it means. After 1200, we do see people start to say she's black on the outside, right? That's what she's saying. She's saying her skin color is black. Although, as you can quite clearly see in the picture, in the kind of historiated initial, the illuminated initial on the screen, this, the guy who illustrated this book in the late 12th century didn't think she was right, gave her white skin despite this declaration. And so it slowly becomes skin color. Black, saying I am black, slowly means I have black skin over the course of the 12th through really 17th century. On the other hand, Ethiopian is a distinct ethnographic term in this period, right? Ethiopians are people who come from a place and have a certain culture. There are good Ethiopians and there are bad Ethiopians. Bad Ethiopians are associated with devils. Good Ethiopians are saved in the apocalypse of John. There's the Ethiopians who are saved from the dragon. And this kind of category of Ethiopian in this pre-12th century period contains a lot of the markers that look like race to us. But after the 12th century, these kind of racialized markers begin to fade. And so when Jacques says black Ethiopian, the reason why it confuses us is because Jacques himself is confused, right? That he doesn't know which one to use. He has kind of two terms that might mean race and might not mean race, but he wants to make really clear he means someone with a racial category and black skin, so he doubles up. And that's the kind of moment of ambiguity, kind of modern ambiguity reading a medieval text, shows us maybe racialization is competing. That's kind of my interpretation of it. That's my answer to that. But I'm the only person who's asked the question. Because this is, again, not a thing that scholars think about right now. It's not a question people kind of want to approach. Most scholarship on medieval studies kind of ignores everything I've just told you about kind of how race works. Ignores things like the idea, critical race theory, and focuses on what we would call genealogies of modern race. That is to say, the kind of tracing the roots of how we now race people. And in the words of Dr. Heng, again, this is written by and for white academics, this kind of history. And like Robert Bartlett, it has worked from its own kind of premises, right? Because it's written by and for white academics, it has not engaged with critical race theory. There are no citations to works of theory. And this is very or infrequently citations to works of theory, even though they would be very helpful in this event. And this is this new medievalist tendency, right? Remember I described this academic tendency to kind of retreat your scholarship into your book, right? To kind of ignore what's going on and I just have my text in front of me. I don't believe that there was black people in the Middle Ages, therefore there weren't black people in the Middle Ages, and therefore I can't find them on my text and I'm not going to pay attention. It's very interesting to note that this is exactly how most scholars before about 1990 talked about women, right? We can't talk about women in the Middle Ages because no one wrote about them. Turns out And most of the scholarship done by and for white academics, revolves around discussions of Jewish persecution. Right? When people want to trace the origins of modern race, they usually start in the Rhineland in 1096. The Rhineland is the Rhine is of course a river in Germany. And in 1096, at the same time that the First Crusade is being launched, and we'll talk more about the First Crusade later, a bunch of people go out and kill Jews. This is called the Rhineland pogrom. Pogrom is I think it's a Russian word. It means smash, means riot. So the Rhineland pogrom, which killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews. We have a bunch of horrific first-person narratives of these events, in which mothers would kill their children to stop them from being mutilated by crusaders and tortured by crusaders. This kind of massive kind of outpouring of violence is kind of seen as the beginning of anti-Jewish persecution, and therefore the beginning of race thinking in the West. This kind of this narrative then kind of moves from Rhineland to kind of an increasingly frequent occurrence of riots and pogroms across Europe. It focuses on things like this, which is the martyrdom of William of Norwich, who's a young boy who was found dead. And the Jews in the English town of Norwich were accused of killing him to steal his blood to make like an anti-communion wafer, to make like a black Sabbath, a negative Sabbath. This is the origin of the word blood, the term blood libel, a term which is still in quite common use to this day. This is also when we see distinctive clothing for Jews in this period. Jews are then expelled from England in 1290. And this kind of periodization, starting about 1100 and going through the later Middle Ages, follows the idea which has been kind of put around, which is the idea of a formation of a persecuting society in this period. That society in general in Western Europe during the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries was particularly interested in identifying and differentiating humans between the right and the wrong, and persecuting those who were wrong, whether that be in terms of Christianity and Jews, Christianity and Muslims, Christians and heretics, being the kind of the most popular categories, clean and unclean, people who are kind of healthy and lepers is also kind of a distinction that comes in there. And this kind of narrative then goes to Iberia, which is to say Spain and Portugal, where there are an abundance of anti-Jewish laws because there is a large Jewish community. Sephardic Jews or Jews from Spain, who had been kind of intermediaries between the Christian and Muslim political powers that were ruling kind of the region. We see anti-Jewish laws. We see forced conversion in Spain, people who are forced to convert are usually called conversos. It just means converted, right? Expulsion of practicing Jews and conversos in 1492, and of course the Spanish Inquisition, which was nowhere near as funny as Monty Python or Mel Brooks have made it out to be, mainly concerned with tracking down what have been called crypto-Jews, which is to say Jews who have converted and are hiding their religious identity in Spain, kind of in the Spanish context, and torturing them until they confess, and then killing them for being relapsed. For relapsing out of Christianity, right? You can't kill a Jew for never converting to Christianity, but once you've left Christianity, then you can be, as it's called, relaxed to the secular arm, which means turned over to someone else to be murdered. And from this kind of story in Spain, we have what has been called the Iberian Roots of Modern Race, which is literally the title of an article that's been written about this subject. Because what people see is they look at this kind of racialization of Jews in Spain, and they say, oh, and then it went to the Americas. Done. This broad narrative also kind of posits a transition from anti-Judaism, kind of in the beginning, to anti-Semitism, right? The idea that Judaism is a religion versus something that Judaism is inherent in the person, which is a transition from ethnicity to race, and a transition from race to racism. Whether or not that distinction holds, I don't like it. We'll talk about that a little bit more. I want to push against this narrative, and others have pushed against this narrative, and I am mostly merely following them for a bunch of reasons. First and foremost, it kind of exculpates Northern Europe. Spain has long been seen as a place which is questionably European at best, both because of mostly because of its medieval history, actually. Like hot-blooded Spaniard, right? Like a little bit Mediterranean, but also a little bit brown, not quite white, if you're kind of an Anglo-Saxon, right? Or an Anglo-Saxon kind of racial, if you're thinking in Anglo-Saxon racial terms. So this kind of pushes off the burden of racism onto a kind of an out-group anyway. Oh, it's not us here in England, just, doing the triangle trade. It was them in Spain, colonizing the Americas before. We don't have to worry about that. Also, I don't think there really is a difference between ethnicity and race. I think in some ways ethnicity is a race without explicit racism, if that makes sense. Or someone who had a race that had been kind of thought of as inferior and now is thought of as equal. Might be a way to talk about that. I think it's an artificial distinction that makes people feel better about themselves. It also focuses, like this narrative focuses on the construction of blackness, of the construction of otherness, rather than the construction of whiteness, which is actually what race is, right? It reverses the story. And finally, it focuses only on big events, right? We have pogrom, blood libel, pogrom, murder, inquisition, death, right? Big moments of persecution. And scholars like David Nierenberg at the University of Chicago have pointed out the fact that actually pretty much every Easter from, let's say, 500 to 1500, the Christian community would gather outside the local synagogue and throw stones at the Jews. That persecution is actually a low-level, constant thing. Microaggressions, not macroaggressions. Right? And that if we only look at the macroaggressions, we form this narrative of increasing persecution, where in fact there was always persecution. Right? It wasn't increasing, it's just becoming more obvious to us because we're looking at these things. It's that people are finding different ways to persecute, not starting from scratch. And so recently, we've had a more complex look, one which kind of tries to understand anti-Semitism intersected with other concerns. And this I want to call a genealogical approach, because what it acknowledges the idea that, there's all these ideas that come together, mate, as it were, fuse, combine genetic material, and something new comes out of that is neither directly any of those things, but is part of all of them, right? And so one major aspect of this genealogy is the idea of purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, which is an idea that comes out of Iberia, yes, in the 15th century. It's an exclusionary idea, the idea that Christians have pure blood, and mingling that blood sexually with Muslims or Jews corrupts it. But like most categories like this, particularly things like, we've talked about this with barbarians before, like you remember the 5th century barbarians. It's a negotiable category, right? Which one you want to pick doesn't depend on what you look like. It depends on what you say you were, right? And so it's the product of memory or the product of deliberate misremembrance. And here the kind of the story about Rachel Dolezal again kind of comes up. By forgetting who her parents were, she was able to change what her race was, right? And when her parents were remembered, her race became something else. Also, in kind of this early Iberian context, bad blood was something that could be overcome and cleansed. And so this idea does not simply mutate, right, into race thinking, but is kind of applied to new situations in the Americas, where you have things like native converts, right? What would be called American Indian converts, African populations coming over and converting populations that were neither Jew nor heretic, right? And so didn't fit into any of these kind of pre-existing persecution categories. And in South America, it meets with class concerns. particularly in South America, because there's a little bit more mobility for a little bit longer. White elites versus brown natives. And we can actually still see this. I am a cycling fan. I will not apologize for that. These are two professional cyclists. On the left is Nairo Quintana. On the right is Esteban Chavez. Nairo Quintana they're both incredibly successful. Nairo Quintana is in fact more successful. He has won the Italian equivalent of the Tour de France. They are both Colombian, and they both ride professionally. Nairo Quintana is, as you can probably tell from his facial features, much more descended from a kind of a native population, and Esteban Chavez can kind of trace his kind of genealogy through from more of a Iberian roots, right? So Esteban Chavez's parents, colonizers, Quintana's parents, colonized. And the way that these two men are talked about in the media is incredibly different. Quintana, right, native, is talked about as being unknowable. His face never shows emotion. And Chavez, his smile is the thing that everyone talks about. He's happy and bubbly. And that's partially a reflection of their personalities, but also a reflection of the kind of deeply ingrained racial thinking along these kind of lines of bad blood. But it's really important to point out that black blood was in kind of South America particularly, was thought of as suspicious, but not unclean. It was not categorized as impure under these rules until the 18th century. And we see highly elaborate distinctions forming. And if you ever heard the kind of very racist term octroon or something like that, let's just say I think that's 1/8 blood, 1/8 African in your descent. That's where these categories come from, right? When they start to try to figure out like who has the most pure blood. But again, individuals can negotiate for purity, right? They can forget black and native ancestors to make their blood more clean. And this, much like kind of the things we've discussed already in this lecture, whitewashes the past. Because if you can forget your black ancestors and you have a social need to forget your black ancestors, you do forget your black ancestors. And therefore you think about your ancestry as purely white, right? That everyone you came from in Europe or whatever was white. And it was part of how we see Europe as hegemonically white before modernity. And this is also kind of in the way we imagine historical persons. These are kind of 4 pictures, 2 contemporary and 2 modern, of Catherine of Aragon, the queen of Henry VIII in 1520 or so. Someone once said to me, if Catherine of Aragon was alive in the Jim Crow South, she would have been made to sit at the back of the bus. But a lot of even contemporary depictions, which again, we're kind of on the cusp of thinking in racial terms, and particularly kind of who is cast to play her, is usually a very white presenting actress. The kind of more, I would say, realistic, but the kind of the depiction of a Spanish dark-haired actress kind of playing Catherine of Aragon is unusual. And so even these kinds of images reinforce an idea of whiteness, because the person at the time would want to claim that whiteness for themselves. And so these ideas of race intersect and meld in what Cord Whitaker, who you're reading for this week, has called the shimmering mirage of pre-modern race. And I like that term a lot because it kind of talks about, it's not a solid, right? Race in the pre-modernity is not a solid thing, right? It's not one thing and it's not the other thing. It is not modern and it's not the opposite of modern. It's a bunch of stuff that's sometimes familiar and sometimes just a blur. Right, there's ethnographic and kind of Galenic distinctions. Galen is a doctor who, if you've heard of the 4 humors, like that's him. And this also these kind of ethnographic distinctions that we've seen with things like, Brian de Bois-Guilbert. But that's a very Galenic approach, by the way, the heat entering the body. Galen was all about heat in very weird ways. That intersects with these Iberian ideas. These Iberian kind of ideas of purity of blood intersect also with the racialized nationalism that I have already talked about developing in France and England, right, over this period of time. And these all come together in the 18th century to form what we would call 19th century race thinking. And of course, 19th century race thinking has evolved since then. Now, there are problems with this approach to kind of understanding where race comes from and where it's going. Because kind of as I kind of hinted at with that example of Jacques de Vitry, it's still only what we can see, right? Scholars haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the ideas that kind of fall off or dead end in the genealogy. Which is what I like to think is one of the things I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And it still is kind of overly focused on kind of the Iberian Judaism, right? That took up a lot of my description just now, right? But from kind of what we need to conclude from this, like the lessons we need to take from this kind of overview of scholarship on medieval race, the way that we've started thinking about it over time, is that first of all, like race is a moving target. Right? And it requires for us to kind of understand as historians an incredibly close and detailed understanding of language, attention to language, right? In a way that, strangely, kind of ironically, in a way that 19th century philologists would have really appreciated. Semantic meanings, the semantic range of words and how they're used is incredibly, incredibly important with thinking about this. And also, I want to kind of emphasize the fact that historians, and particularly historians of the Middle Ages, have been deliberately bad at doing this, right? There has been a kind of a happy ignorance, a deliberate kind of blissful ignorance of all this. And even those who do kind of try to push forward, are hamstrung by previous ideas, either because of resistance. The academy is an inherently conservative place. I know people talk about like professors radicalizing youth. No. What did someone say? No one's going to teach you how to overthrow them, right? That's not a thing that happens. So either kind of directly or indirectly, like, okay, we have to disprove the ideas that came before, and so you still have to talk about those ideas that came before. And as I said, kind of as much as some are working for change, others are working to preserve the status quo. And we'll talk a lot about kind of controversies that are currently very much active within kind of medievalists in general, but between medieval history and kind of medieval studies more generally, I find. And this kind of, because when it comes to race and when it comes to modern perceptions of race in the Middle Ages, this is a moment where neo-medievalism, right, kind of popular understandings of kind of fantasy medievalism, as it were, and new medievalism, which is, say, a theory-adverse positivistic history, collide. And that's going to be the subject of a little bit of next lecture, and it's going to be the subject of kind of the last couple weeks of our course. All right, before we go, before everything ends, just a reminder that questions on this lecture, and this lecture is, I feel, quite complicated and kind of bouncing around between a lot of difficult subjects, should be emailed to me by Thursday at noon. My email address has not changed. Office hours this week are as they usually are, Wednesday 1 to 3, with a link on Canvas, of course, to them. If you can't make those office hours for whatever reason, although you should, because Wednesday 1 to 2 is a class. No, wait, that's not class time. Anyway, yes it is. That's class time, so you should technically have that hour free. Please just send me an email. I know some of you are in different time zones. Like, just send me an email. I can meet earlier in the day, so we're not meeting at 8 or 9 o'clock at your time. Sections this week are as usual. And again, just kind of warning you that midterm projects are coming soon. They're due the 26th of February. If you look at the kind of question and answer session I gave for the previous week, question and answer section, you will find more information about that there. Other than that, I'll see you guys next lecture.